The moment Nellie Wells stepped off the stagecoach in Harlan Creek, Kansas, in the spring of 1878, 3 different men told her she wouldn't last a month. She heard the first one as she gathered her traveling bags from the dusty boot of the coach, a broad-shouldered rancher with sun-cracked skin who looked her up, and down the way, a man sizes up livestock he's already decided isn't worth buying. She heard the second from the postmaster, who laughed openly when she asked about the schoolteacher's position that had been advertised in the St. Louis Gazette. And she heard the third from the barkeep at the Dusty Rose Saloon, where she'd gone only to ask directions to the boarding house, and where she was met with a kind of laughter that had no warmth in it at all. Harlan Creek was not a gentle town. It sat on the edge of the Kansas plains like a bad tooth in a dry mouth, functional, necessary, and painful to encounter. The streets were wide and unpaved, rutted by wagon wheels and eroded by wind that came off the prairie with nothing to stop it for 50 miles in any direction. The buildings were mostly timber and sod, weathered to a gray that matched the sky in winter. Cattle drives still cut through the main road on their way north, and the smell of dust and manure and wood smoke was as constant as the wind itself. The women who survived in Harlan Creek were not the kind who pressed wildflowers between the pages of their journals. They were the kind who hauled water before dawn, who set broken bones when there was no doctor, who plowed fields alongside their husbands and still put 3 meals on the table. They had arms like oak and voices that carried across a 1/4 mile of open land. They had been forged by the frontier the way metal is forged in fire, with great heat and significant pain. And then there was Nellie Wells, 24 years old, with dark hair she kept pinned neatly beneath a straw bonnet, soft hands that had never worked a plow, and a voice that people said sounded like it belonged in a parlor back east. She had come from a decent family in Springfield, Missouri, her father a schoolteacher, her mother a woman of letters who had read to Nellie every evening until Nellie could read faster than her mother could speak. Nellie had trained as a teacher herself, had taught 2 years in Springfield before she'd seen the advertisement in the Gazette calling for a schoolteacher in Harlan Creek, Kansas, and had felt something she couldn't quite name rise up in her chest like a flame catching tinder. She had packed her trunk, kissed her mother's cheek, and come west on the train and then the stage, and she had arrived here, in this wind-bitten town that smelled of cattle and dismissed her in the same breath. The boarding house was run by a woman named Mrs. Cordelia Hatch, who was somewhere north of 60, and ran her establishment with a precision that would have impressed a military general. Mrs. Hatch showed Nellie her room narrow, with a window that looked out over the main street and a draft that came through the wall boards when the wind blew from the north, and then sat her down at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that was stronger than anything Nellie had ever tasted. "You the new schoolteacher?" Mrs. Hatch asked, studying Nellie with eyes that were sharp as a hawk's. "I am, if the position is still open," Nellie said. "It's open. 3 teachers before you lasted a combined total of 8 months. 2 went back east. 1 married a farmer and gave up the schoolhouse entirely." Mrs. Hatch refilled her own coffee. "The children here are not like children back east. They've been raised hard. Some of them work the fields or the cattle before school and after. Some of them don't see the point of schooling at all. Their parents don't always see it either." "I understand," Nellie said. Mrs. Hatch looked at her for a long moment. "Do you? Because you look like a woman who's used to things being understood before they become difficult." Nellie set down her coffee cup. "With respect, Mrs. Hatch, I've heard some version of that statement 3 times since I stepped off the stage this afternoon. I appreciate the honesty, but I didn't come out here expecting easy. I came out here expecting meaningful." Mrs. Hatch studied her for another long moment, and then something shifted in her expression, not quite warmth, not yet, but the beginning of respect. "All right then," she said. "Breakfast is at 6. Don't be late." The schoolhouse was a single room made of rough timber, with 12 desks arranged in rows, a chalkboard at the front, and a wood stove in the corner that, as Nellie would discover, smoked when the wind blew from the southeast. It sat at the eastern edge of town, near a creek that gave Harlan Creek its name, and in the mornings the light came through the two windows in long, dusty shafts that caught the chalk dust Nellie raised when she wrote on the board. On her first morning, 9 children came. She had been told to expect 14. The 9 who arrived ranged in age from 6 to 13, and they looked at her with the particular kind of wariness that children develop when they have learned that adults are not always reliable. The oldest of them, a boy named Danny Pratt, told her flatly during introductions that he didn't see what use reading Shakespeare was when a man needed to know how to rope a calf. Nellie had looked at him steadily and said, "Shakespeare wrote about men and cattle too. He wrote about ambition and betrayal and loyalty and love. Those aren't Eastern things, Danny. Those are human things, and they happen right here in Kansas just the same as they happened in London." Danny had looked skeptical, but he'd stayed in his seat. By the end of the first week, she had 12 children in the classroom. By the end of the second, 14. Word had apparently spread, not that the new teacher was impressive or brilliant, but that she was patient, and that she did not shout, and that she found ways to make the lessons make sense to a child who spent more of their waking hours outside than in. She taught arithmetic through the calculation of cattle prices and harvest yields. She taught reading through stories that included horses and weather and the kind of work these children's hands already knew. She brought the prairie inside the classroom, and in doing so she made the classroom a place the prairie children could actually inhabit. She was, in short, a remarkable teacher, but the adults of Harlan Creek were not so easily convinced. The first real resistance came from a man named Gerald Pratt, Danny's father, who was also the owner of the largest cattle operation within 20 miles of town, and who sat on the informal council of men who, in the absence of any formal civic structure, made the decisions that shaped Harlan Creek's daily life. Gerald Pratt was a big man with a red face and opinions he held with the force of stone walls. He came to the schoolhouse on a Friday afternoon at the end of Nellie's third week and stood in the doorway after the children had gone, looking at the room as if he were assessing property he wasn't sure he wanted to buy. "Miss Wells," he said. It was not a greeting so much as an announcement. "Mr. Pratt," she replied, setting down her chalk. "My boy tells me you've been teaching them poetry." "Among other things, yes." Gerald Pratt crossed his arms. "Miss Wells, this is cattle country. The boys here are going to grow up to be ranchers and cowboys and farmers. The girls are going to marry those men and run their households. What exactly does poetry prepare them for?" Nellie looked at him calmly. She had been expecting something like this, though perhaps not quite so directly. "Poetry teaches them to think carefully about language," she said, "to be precise about what they mean and deliberate about how they say it. Those are skills that serve a rancher in a land negotiation, and a farmer in a contract dispute, and a woman in every conversation she'll ever have about the running of her home. Beyond that, Mr. Pratt, knowing that beauty exists, knowing that someone else has looked at the world and found words for what they felt, that sustains a person through hard times. And hard times do come here. Even you would agree with that." Gerald Pratt was quiet for a moment. He looked at her the way men often looked at her here, as if she were a puzzle that was more complicated than it appeared, and he wasn't sure he wanted to do the work of solving it. Then he uncrossed his arms and said, "Don't fill their heads with nonsense," and walked out. It was not agreement, but it was not the demand that she leave either, and Nellie took it as the draw it was. She had been in Harlan Creek for a month before she met Charles Atkins properly. She had seen him before, the way you see everyone in a town of 400 souls passing on the main street, at the general store, at the Sunday service that was held in the saloon, because the church building had blown down in a windstorm 2 years ago and had not yet been rebuilt. He was tall, lean in the way of men who work physically hard and eat only what they need, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar and hands that were calloused and capable. He had a face that was weathered but not harsh. The sun had put lines at the corners of his eyes and across his forehead, but the eyes themselves were a clear, warm brown that observed things closely without judgment. He was 28 years old, and he ran the livery stable at the north end of town, which he had built himself 3 years ago after arriving in Harlan Creek with a little money saved from a cattle drive and the decision that he was done with the open road. He was quiet in the way of men who have spent a great deal of time alone, not unfriendly but not forthcoming either, and the general impression he gave was of a man who watched more than he spoke and who had thought more deeply about most things than he let on. Their proper introduction happened at the general store on a Wednesday afternoon in May. Nellie was purchasing chalk and a bottle of ink and a small packet of dried lavender. She intended to put in the corner of the schoolhouse because the wood stove made the room smell of smoke, and she thought something sweeter might help the children focus. She was at the counter when she heard a low, clear voice behind her say, "Mrs. Calloway, I believe you've shorted me on the feed count again." The storekeeper's wife, who ran the establishment on the days her husband was ill, which was frequent, looked up from the ledger with an expression of pure irritation. "I have done no such thing, Mr. Atkins." 3 bags of oats versus the 4 on the order, Charles Atkins said, and his voice was still calm, still even, still carrying no heat at all. "I'm not accusing anyone of dishonesty. I'm only noting a discrepancy." Nellie turned slightly and watched the exchange. She watched the way he held himself, not aggressive, not submissive, simply present, as if he were entirely at ease in his own body and his own certainty. The storekeeper's wife eventually consulted the ledger and acknowledged that there had in fact been an error, and Charles Atkins nodded and thanked her with complete sincerity. No triumph in it, no told you so. He noticed Nellie watching then. Their eyes met across the counter, and something in his expression shifted just slightly, just briefly, the way a door opens a crack before someone decides whether to open it fully. "Miss Wells," he said. "Mr. Atkins," she replied. "I've seen you at the livery. And I've seen you at the schoolhouse. You have the children longer than any teacher I can remember." A pause. "That's meant as a compliment." "I took it as one," she said. He picked up his remaining bags of oats, one in each arm, easy as breathing, and nodded to her again. "Good afternoon, Miss Wells." "Good afternoon, Mr. Atkins." He walked out, and the storekeeper's wife looked at Nellie with the pointed interest of a woman who has nothing against a little gossip. "He's a good man," she said, with a particular emphasis on good that implied she was also noting that he was unmarried, decent-looking, and likely in need of what a schoolteacher might provide. Nellie pretended she hadn't caught the implication and paid for her chalk. The next time she spoke to Charles Atkins, it was because of an animal. She had been walking back from school on a Thursday evening in late May, the air warm and golden with the particular generosity of a Kansas spring afternoon, when she heard a sound near the alley beside the feed barn, a small, thin sound, barely audible over the wind. She stopped and listened, and the sound came again, and she followed it to the side of the building where a dog lay in the dirt, one of its hind legs clearly injured, its brown eyes looking up at her with the patient desperation that animals have when they know they cannot help themselves. Nellie crouched down without hesitating and spoke to the dog quietly, the same tone she used with a child who had scraped a knee, low and calm and clear, and the dog allowed her to come close enough to look at the leg. She was still crouched there, her good skirt entirely in the dust, her hat pushed back on her head, gently running her hand over the dog's flank when she heard boots on the dirt behind her. "That's Biscuit," Charles Atkins said. "He belongs to nobody particular, which means he belongs to everyone, which means no one has looked after him properly." Nellie looked up. He was standing at the corner of the alley, his thumbs in his belt, looking at her and the dog with an expression she couldn't quite read. "His leg is badly hurt," she said. "Can you help me carry him somewhere?" He looked at her for a moment, not at the dog, at her, as if he were measuring something. Then he came forward and crouched beside her in the alley, and he looked at the leg with knowledgeable eyes and careful hands, and he said, "It's not broken. A cut, maybe from a wagon wheel." needs cleaning. Will you carry him? He won't take it well from a stranger. He knows me some, Charles said. He gathered the dog up with the same easy sureness he'd carried the feed bags, and the dog whimpered once and then settled, and Charles walked him up to the livery stable and into the back room where the medical supplies for the horses were kept. Nellie followed without being invited, and he didn't tell her not to come. She held the dog steady while Charles cleaned the wound, and she talked to the dog the whole time, steady, quiet, gentle talk, and after a while the dog stopped trembling. Charles wrapped the leg with clean cloth and then sat back on his heels and looked at the dog for a moment, and then at Nellie. "You've got good hands," he said. "Steady." "I've bandaged plenty of scrapes," she said. "Children are accident-prone." He almost smiled. She could see it wanting to happen at the corners of his mouth, pressing against the habitual quiet of his expression. "I suppose they are. Does the dog have anywhere to sleep that isn't an alley?" Charles looked at the dog, who had now laid his head on Nellie's knee with the complete trust of the comfortable animal. "He can stay in the stable," he said. "It's not the first time." Nellie stroked the dog's ears. "What's your dog's name?" "He's not my dog. He's living in your stable." Another almost smile. "I suppose Biscuit and I have an understanding." "That sounds like a dog," Nellie said. And then she laughed, a real laugh, uncalculated, genuine, and the sound of it in the close, hay-smelling warmth of the stable back room seemed to surprise him. His expression opened, just slightly, just enough for her to see that there was a great deal more warmth in those brown eyes than the quiet he usually carried suggested. "You're not what I expected," he said, and then immediately looked as if he hadn't intended to say it. "What did you expect?" He thought about it honestly. She could see him thinking, not searching for a polite answer but for a true one. "I thought you'd be gone by now," he finally said. "Most people said you would be." "Most people are wrong," she said pleasantly. "But I don't hold it against them. They don't know me yet." He was quiet for a moment, and she let the quiet sit without filling it, which was something she'd learned from the children. That silence, if you didn't panic it, often told you more than words. And in this silence what she heard was a man reconsidering something, revising an assumption, making a small but significant adjustment to the map he carried of the world. "Would you like coffee?" he asked. "There's a pot on in the stable office." "I would," she said. The coffee was terrible. She drank it anyway, and so did he, and they sat on two wooden chairs in the small office that served as the administrative center of the Atkins livery stable, and they talked for an hour in the fading evening light, while Biscuit slept on a pile of straw in the corner. She learned that he had grown up in Tennessee, that his father had been a blacksmith, that he had drifted west on cattle drives for 3 years in his early 20s, and seen enough of the country to decide that he wanted to put down roots somewhere it felt like it mattered to do so. He had chosen Harlan Creek because it needed a livery, and because the land felt honest to him, open and demanding and without pretense, the kind of place where what you put in was exactly what you got out. He learned that she was from Springfield, that her father had died 2 years ago and left her mother in comfortable but reduced circumstances, and that she had come west not out of desperation, but out of a genuine conviction that the frontier needed what she had to offer, and that nobody was going to believe that until she showed them. "They think gentle means weak here," she said, turning her coffee cup in her hands. The evening light had gone blue and low through the office window. "That softness is a liability." Charles looked at her steadily. "They're wrong," he said. Something about the simplicity and the certainty of it, the fact that he offered no qualification, no however, hit her somewhere in the chest and stayed there. "Not many people have said that to me since I arrived," she admitted. "It needs saying," he said. "This land has had enough hard things done to it in the name of strength. The cattle drives, the land disputes, the people who were here before us who were pushed out and killed and had everything they'd built taken from them." He paused, and something crossed his face that was dark and complicated and honest. "I'm not sure more hardness is what heals any of that." Nellie looked at him carefully. It was not the kind of thing she had expected to hear in a livery stable in Harlan Creek, Kansas. "You've thought about this," she said. "I've had a lot of time alone to think," he said. The horses don't judge a man for his opinions." She smiled at that. He watched her smile with the same careful attention he seemed to give everything, as if he were filing it away somewhere important. She walked back to Mrs. Hatch's boarding house in the blue dark of the Kansas evening, and she was aware, in the particular way of a woman who has been paying attention to her own interior life for 24 years, that something had shifted in the landscape of her world. It was not dramatic. It was not the thunderclap that novels described. It was quieter than that, the way the light changes a minute before sunrise, when the sky is still dark but you can already tell that the dark is different now, that something is coming. She did not tell Mrs. Hatch about it, but Mrs. Hatch noticed the particular expression on Nellie's face when she came in through the kitchen door, and she refilled Nellie's coffee without being asked, which was Mrs. Hatch's version of a pointed remark. June in Harlan Creek was hot and bright and smelled of buffalo grass, and the particular dry electricity that preceded the afternoon thunderstorms that rolled in off the plains with very little warning and an enormous amount of drama. The town moved with the rhythms of the season cattle drives up from the south, crops coming in, the days long and the light slant and golden, and the nights full of cricket song and the vast, starry sweep of the Kansas sky. Nellie fell into a rhythm of her own. She taught in the mornings and early afternoons. She walked in the evenings, sometimes alone, sometimes with Mrs. Hatch's neighbor, a young widow named Clara Birch, who was 26 and had been in Harlan Creek for 4 years, and who had the particular competence of a woman who had built her own life entirely by her own hands after her husband had died of fever in their 2nd year of marriage. Clara was the first person in Harlan Creek who had treated Nellie as an equal from the very beginning, not because she was soft or kind in the way that dismissed, but because she simply looked at Nellie and saw another capable woman who had chosen to be here, and that was enough for her. They walked together in the evenings along the creek, and Clara told her about the town's history, the hard winters, the land disputes, the families that had come and gone, the slow building of something that might, in another generation, be called a community. It was Clara who first mentioned Charles Atkins's history in a way that explained him. "He came here after a cattle drive 3 years ago," Clara said one evening, the two of them sitting on the creek bank with their shoes off, their feet in the cold water, the sky above them going orange and pink and deep violet. "He'd been on the drive since he was 19, seen things, some of it ugly. He doesn't talk about it much, but you can tell it's in him somewhere. The way the land was taken, the conflicts with the tribes, the violence that gets passed off as progress." She looked sideways at Nellie. "He's a fair man, fairest man in Harlan Creek probably, won't buy from anyone who cheats. Paid the Navarro family more than market rate for their horses because he said the rate was artificially low and they deserved better. He seems like a man who lives by a considered set of principles," Nellie said. Clara gave her a look that was warm and slightly amused. "That is a schoolteacher's way of saying he's a good man." "I suppose it is," Nellie said, and smiled at the water. "He hasn't courted anyone since he got here," Clara said, which was not a non sequitur, regardless of how she offered it, in case that was of any interest. "It wasn't something I was wondering about," Nellie said. "Of course not," said Clara, with the serenity of a woman who knows exactly what she's doing and is entirely unapologetic about it. Charles Atkins was not a man who courted openly or dramatically. He was a man who showed up. He appeared at the schoolhouse on a Tuesday morning in the 2nd week of June with 2 panes of glass to replace the cracked window that had let in the wind all spring, and he fixed them himself, quietly and efficiently, before the children arrived. He left a sack of good firewood for the stove at the schoolhouse door on the first cold morning of late June without attaching his name to it, although it was absolutely clear to Nellie whose hands had split and stacked the wood. He stopped to speak to her on the main street in the mornings with a naturalness that suggested he had rearranged his route to make the stops possible, though she doubted he would have admitted as much. What he did, in other words, was take care. He paid attention to what she needed before she named it, and he provided it in the particular language of the frontier: practical, concrete, useful, offered without expectation or fuss. And in that language, which Nellie was learning to read, there was something that felt profoundly like tenderness. She reciprocated in her own language. She brought him a book she had finished, a volume of Whitman's poetry that she thought he might respond to, given the things he'd said about the land and what it meant, and left it at the stable office with a note that said, simply, "This seemed like it belonged to you." She brought him a jar of Mrs. Hatch's apple preserves at Christmas, because she'd heard him tell the blacksmith that he missed apple anything and couldn't grow an apple tree in this soil if his life depended on it. She stopped at the stable sometimes in the evenings, ostensibly to check on Biscuit, who was healed and was now the unofficial mascot of the Atkins livery, and who greeted her arrival each time with the specific ecstasy that is unique to dogs and children. It was Biscuit who gave them their conversations. The dog was an excuse that neither of them needed and both of them appreciated. On a Tuesday evening in July, a particular thing happened that would later seem, looking back, like the moment when the whole slow drift of things became a river with direction and purpose. A boy named Eli Hansen, 8 years old, small for his age, the quietest child in the schoolhouse, had not come to school for 3 days. Nellie had asked his older sister about it, and the sister had said only that Eli was home, and she'd looked away when she said it in a way that told Nellie more than the words did. After school on the 3rd day, Nellie walked to the Hansen farm, which was a mile east of town, and knocked on the door. The woman who answered, Eli's mother, a worn and tired woman of perhaps 35 who looked a decade older, took one look at Nellie and stepped back to let her in without a word, as if she'd been expected. Eli was in the corner of the main room, sitting against the wall with his knees drawn up. He had a bruise along his jaw that had gone the particular yellow-green of healing, and a look in his eyes that Nellie recognized as the specific withdrawal of a child who has learned to make himself small. He looked up when she came in, and something in his face loosened slightly, the particular relief of seeing a person he knew was safe. Nellie sat down on the floor next to him. Not at the table, not in a chair on the floor, at his level, in his corner of the world. And she didn't ask him questions. She simply sat with him and talked, gently and quietly, about the things they'd been studying in school, about a passage from a story she knew he'd liked, about what Biscuit had been doing lately. She talked until she could see his shoulders come down from around his ears and his breathing slow. She stayed for 2 hours. When she left, she spoke privately to Eli's mother, and then she walked straight to the marshal's office, such as it was, a single room where a man named Tom Greer served as Harlan Creek's sole law, and she told Tom Greer what she'd seen and what she believed was happening in that house. She was precise and calm and absolutely unyielding about it, and Tom Greer, who was generally a reasonable man, listened. She was walking back along the main street afterward, the sun heavy and orange in the west, her heart still beating fast with the particular adrenaline of having done something difficult and necessary, when Charles Atkins fell into step beside her. "You've been to the Hansen place," he said. It wasn't a question. She looked at him. "How did you know?" "Because you walked past the stable going east 3 hours ago, and you have the look of a woman who just went to battle," he said. She let out a breath that was half a laugh and half something more complicated. "Eli Hansen has been hurt," she said. "I've spoken to Marshal Greer." He was quiet for a moment. "Good," he said. The word was simple, weighted, wholly sufficient. "People think gentleness means you won't act," she said. The frustration she'd been holding came through in her voice, controlled but audible. "They think if you're kind, if you speak softly, if you don't storm in with anger, you won't do anything real. But it's not true. It has never been true." Charles stopped walking. She stopped too, and turned to look at him. And what she saw on his face was not the expression of a man who was about to agree with her politely. It was the expression of a man who had been thinking this very thing for a long time and had been waiting, without quite knowing it, for someone to say it aloud. "Gentle was what this land has always been missing," he said quietly. Not weakness, not inaction, gentleness. The kind that sees what is actually in front of it and responds to it honestly without pretending the hard things aren't hard. He held her eyes. You have that. She looked at him in the orange evening light of that July street, the dust moving in slow eddies around their feet, the last of the day's heat radiating from the packed earth, and she felt the full weight of what he had said and the complete sincerity with which he had said it. No one in Harlan Creek had said anything to her that felt more like being truly seen. No one anywhere, perhaps, in a long time. "Thank you, Charles," she said. She had not called him by his first name before. It came out easily, as if it had always belonged in her mouth. Something in his face, the guarded, watching quality that was usually there, shifted, like a window opening. "You're welcome, Nellie," he said. Eli Hansen came back to school the following Monday. He looked lighter. He sat in his usual seat and participated for the first time in a class discussion, his small voice careful but real. Marshall Greer had made a visit to the Hansen farm, and certain arrangements had been made. And while the full resolution of difficult situations in a frontier town in 1878 was never clean or simple, the worst of what had been happening to Eli had been stopped. Nellie knew it wasn't a perfect outcome. She knew the systems of protection for children were inadequate, that the law's reach was short, that Eli's path forward would still be hard. But he was here in this room, choosing to be here, and that mattered enormously. She caught herself, at the end of that school day, thinking that she needed to tell Charles how it had gone. The impulse was so natural and so immediate that it was only after she'd had it that she realized what it meant, that she had begun to think of him as the person she wanted to share things with. Not just things that happened, things that mattered. She walked to the stable that evening under the pretense of checking on Biscuit, who did not need checking on, and she found Charles in the paddock behind the stable, working with a young horse that had arrived that week, moving the animal through its paces with the infinite patience of a man who understood that trust takes time and cannot be rushed. She leaned on the fence rail and watched him, and Biscuit sat beside her and watched too, the way dogs do when they are comfortable and happy, and in no particular need of doing anything else. After a while, Charles brought the horse to a stop and came over to the fence. He rested his forearms on the top rail beside her, close enough that their arms nearly touched, and for a moment they both looked at the horse, which was drinking from the trough and flicking its tail at the evening insects. "Eli came back today," she said. "I know," he said. "I saw him this morning." He paused. His face looked different. "Yes, because of what you did," she shook her head. "Because of a lot of things, but partly, maybe." He turned to look at her then, and she turned to look at him, and the distance between them on that fence rail was very small, and the evening was warm and gold around them, and Biscuit made a contented sound beside her, and Charles Atkins said, "I'd like to take you for a ride on Saturday if you'd allow it. There's a part of this prairie I think you'd appreciate. The creek widens about 4 miles east and there are cottonwoods. It's a good place." She had never heard him speak with the slightest hesitation before. The small stumble over the word "it's" told her more than any declaration could have done. "I would like that very much," she said. The Saturday ride was a revelation. He had saddled a horse for her, a steady bay mare named Rosie, who, as Charles explained, was patient with riders who were not accustomed to open country riding, and who would not startle easily. Nellie was not an accomplished rider, but she had ridden enough to manage, and she sat straight in the saddle and followed his lead as they rode east out of Harlan Creek into the open prairie. The land unrolled around them like something breathing. The big bluestem grass moved in the morning wind in slow, silver-green waves, and the sky above them was the particular deep blue that only happens on a clear summer morning, before the heat builds and the clouds begin to rise. Meadowlarks called from fence posts and from the grass, and jackrabbits bolted ahead of the horses' hooves, and the whole world smelled of sun and earth and the clean electric smell of open space. She felt the city fall off her like a coat she'd been wearing too long. Charles rode beside her and pointed things out, not in the manner of a guide performing a tour, but in the manner of a man showing a person he trusts the things he loves. That rise of ground to the north where you could see 15 miles in every direction on a clear day. The red-tailed hawks circling above the grass. The way the light changed over the prairie at different times of day, like water over different kinds of stone. "You love this place," she said. "I do," he said simply. "I didn't expect to when I came. I thought it would be a stopping place, but the land gets into you." He looked out over the grass. "It demands something of you, this country. It's honest. It doesn't pretend to be easier than it is." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't." They reached the cottonwoods after an hour's ride, and the transformation was extraordinary from the open, grassy prairie to a grove of tall, broad trees along the widened creek, their silver-green leaves turning and catching the light like coins, the shade beneath them cool and dappled, the creek running clear over stones with a sound that seemed, after the wide silence of the prairie, extraordinarily intimate. They tied the horses in the shade and sat on the creek bank, and they talked for 3 hours. They talked about things they had not talked about before, about faith and doubt, about the injustice of how the land had been taken from the tribes who had lived here for centuries, about what the frontier was supposed to mean and what it had actually become, about loss and hope, and the specific courage it takes to begin something in a new place. They talked about their childhoods and their parents and the particular shapes that loneliness can take. At some point during the afternoon, he told her something she had not known, that he had once, on a cattle drive through Colorado, witnessed an act of violence against a family of Cheyenne people that had been the moment he understood, with his whole body, that what was being called progress in this country was sometimes nothing of the kind. He had been 20 years old, and he had not been able to stop what happened. He had carried the weight of it ever since, not as guilt exactly, but as responsibility, a responsibility to do things differently, to choose differently, in whatever sphere he inhabited. To be a fair man, a careful man, a man who looked at the people in front of him and responded to what was actually there. He told her this quietly, without drama, looking at the water. When he finished, he was silent for a moment, and she said nothing immediately, because she understood that some things require the respect of silence before you respond to them. Then she said, "The weight of that kind of witness doesn't leave a person, but it can become something other than only pain. It can become the reason you are the way you are, the fairness you bring to things. That matters, Charles. That matters to real people in real lives." He looked at her then, and his expression was the most open she had ever seen it, entirely unguarded, entirely present. She thought she had never seen a person look quite so much like themselves as he did in that moment, by the creek, in the cottonwood shade. He reached out and took her hand where it rested on the grass between them. He took it carefully, as if it were something valuable, and held it with the same steadiness he brought to everything else. She let her fingers fold around his, and they sat that way for a long time, watching the water move over the stones, while the afternoon shifted around them and the horses cropped grass in the shade and a kingfisher made its angular passes over the creek's surface. She knew, absolutely and without doubt, that she was in love with him. She suspected, from the way his thumb moved slowly across her knuckles, that he knew it too. The summer deepened. They saw each other with growing frequency and less pretense. He walked her to school some mornings. She brought books to the stable in the evenings. On Sunday afternoons after the service, they walked the town together, the kind of walking that is not going anywhere in particular but is going somewhere important nonetheless. And the town watched and drew its conclusions, and the conclusions were, for the most part, favorable. Mrs. Hatch said nothing at all, which from Mrs. Hatch was the highest possible form of approval. Clara Birch said, "I told you so," with the magnificent satisfaction of someone who has been entirely right. Gerald Pratt, who had come back to the schoolhouse in August to complain that the children were spending too much time on poetry and not enough on practical arithmetic, found himself in a conversation with Nellie that lasted 40 minutes, at the end of which he had agreed to donate a new set of arithmetic textbooks to the school, and had looked, as he left, vaguely surprised at himself. Charles, who passed the schoolhouse during this conversation, saw Pratt's expression as the man walked out and said to Nellie later, "Whatever you said to that man, he looks like a person who's just discovered the earth is round." "I simply listened to what he actually needed," she said. Once you know what someone actually needs, it's much easier to meet them in the middle. Charles looked at her with that particular warmth in his brown eyes that had become, over these months, one of her favorite sights in the world. "You are remarkable," he said, quietly, plainly, without flourish. "You're not bad yourself," she said, and he laughed, a real, full laugh that she loved, because he gave it rarely and she had learned to treasure the things he gave rarely. In September, something happened that tested them both. A man named Ward Bellamy arrived in Harlan Creek. He was a land speculator, one of many moving through Kansas in those years, buying up land cheaply or by means that were less than legal, accumulating acreage with the intention of selling it at significant profit to the railroad companies that were pushing their lines further west. He set up in the Dusty Rose Saloon and began having conversations with the men of the town. And those conversations had the particular shape of conversations designed to sound casual while being carefully purposeful. What Nellie learned, through Clara, who had ears everywhere, was that Bellamy had his eye on the land that the Hanson family farmed east of town. The Hanson farm sat on good soil and sat adjacent to a creek, which made it valuable. Bellamy had already approached Eli's uncle, who had some nominal claim to a portion of the land, and had made him an offer that the uncle had, unwisely, considered seriously. Nellie did not like this. She did not like it with the particular dislike of a woman who has recently sat on the floor of a child's home and understood, in her whole body, how much security and safety that home represented to that child. She talked to Charles about it one evening, walking along the creek at the edge of town, and he listened with the focused attention he brought to everything she said, not the polite performance of listening but the real thing, the kind where you can tell the person is actually revising their thinking as you speak. "Bellamy is within the law," he said when she finished. "Technically, the offer to the uncle may be exploitative, but it's not illegal." "I know," she said, "but Mrs. Hanson has rights to that land too. She was married to a man who homesteaded it. Her claim should supersede any deal her brother-in-law makes." Charles was quiet for a moment. "Do you know if she has her papers?" "Her deed? I don't know, but we should find out." He looked at her sidelong. He said. "If you're willing," she said. "I thought we might speak to her together, and if she doesn't have the deed, we could help her get a copy from the county seat. That's Dodge City, which is a day and a half's ride," he said. "I know it. Would you go?" He didn't hesitate. "Yes." They went to see Mrs. Hanson the next day after school, and what they found was that the woman did have her deed folded and creased, tucked inside a Bible on the kitchen shelf, but that she didn't fully understand what it meant or what protections it offered her. Nellie read through it carefully and explained it to her in plain, clear language while Charles sat at the kitchen table and drank the coffee he was offered and watched Nellie work with the quiet, attentive admiration of a man who knows he is watching something genuinely skilled. Mrs. Hanson, who understood when she was being helped, cried a little quietly, and then straightened up and said she would go herself to speak to Marshal Greer. She did. Marshal Greer, properly informed, had a conversation with Ward Bellamy that apparently involved a clear and definitive description of the legal situation, and Bellamy was seen on the southbound stage 2 days later, and that was the end of that. The town took note. Not loudly. Harlan Creek was not a town that made a fuss about things, as a rule, but with the particular shift in collective regard that happens when a community watches someone do something genuinely useful in a way that required courage. Nellie found that conversations on the main street were different after that. People looked at her differently, not as the gentle Eastern schoolteacher who wouldn't last the winter, but as a woman of the town, one of theirs. Gerald Pratt, of all people, stopped her on the street and said gruffly, "That was good work, Miss Wells," and walked on before she could respond, which was, coming from Gerald Pratt, practically a standing ovation. Charles heard about the exchange and smiled the slow, warm smile she had come to love specifically because of its rarity. "He doesn't say that to anyone," he said. "I know," she said. "I almost feel bad for him. It cost him something." "It usually costs a man something to admit he was wrong," Charles said, and then, after a pause, "It's worth it, though, in my experience." She looked at him. "What were you wrong about?" He looked back at her, and the honesty in his eyes was the most attractive thing about him, which was saying something because there was considerable competition. "I thought you might leave," he said. "In the spring. I thought you were the kind of person who would try and then go back to where things were easier. I was wrong." "Yes, you were," she said warmly. "But I forgive you. You didn't know me yet." "No," he said. "I didn't." They were standing on the main street of Harlan Creek in the September afternoon, and everything was ordinary around them. Wagons passing, dogs lying in the shade of the storefronts, the smell of bread from the bakery that had opened that summer, the sound of the wind. And she thought she had never been so happy anywhere in her life as she was in this particular moment, in this dust-end wind town that she had chosen, and that was, slowly, and with the habitual reluctance of a hard place towards soft things, beginning to choose her back. The autumn came on fast and golden, the way Kansas autumns do, a sudden sharpening of the light, a deepening of the sky's blue, the grasses going amber and red, the air taking on the clean, bright cold of the season. Nellie ordered new books for the school from St. Louis, a reader that Clara had found an advertisement for, a set of geography volumes, a collection of stories she thought the children would love. And they arrived in October, and she unpacked them in the schoolroom with the specific joy of a person in the presence of new books, and she laid them out on the desks and stood back and looked at them and felt entirely certain she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Charles asked her to dinner on a Friday in October, not the coffee in the stable office kind of dinner. He asked her, formally, to the hotel restaurant that had opened in the spring, Harlan Creek's, one attempt at something resembling the amenities of a larger town, with tablecloths and a menu written in careful script and candles in glass holders on each table. He asked her with visible effort, as if the formality of asking cost him more than the ordinary conversations that came easily between them by now. "I'd be honored," she said. She said it gently, because she could see that he had spent some of himself on the asking. He came to Mrs. Hatch's boarding house at 6 in the evening, wearing a clean shirt and a dark jacket she'd never seen him in and his good boots, and he had, improbably, managed to find a single late-season flower somewhere, a small, tough yellow prairie aster, and he gave it to her with the air of a man who is not entirely sure this was a good idea, but has committed and is seeing it through. She had put on her best dress, which was a deep blue that she knew suited her, and she had arranged her hair differently, and when she came downstairs to meet him, he looked at her the way she had been looking at him for months, as if the sight of her rewrote something in his chest. They walked to the hotel restaurant in the cool autumn evening, and Mrs. Hatch watched them go from the front window with an expression that, had anyone been there to see it, would have surprised people who thought of her as a woman without sentiment. Over dinner, which was beef and roasted potatoes and bread, and very good for all of that, they talked and laughed, and shared a piece of apple pie that the restaurant had somehow managed to produce with the season's last fruit, and the candlelight made everything warm and close, and there were two other couples dining at nearby tables who paid them no mind, which was exactly right. After dinner they walked home slowly through the autumn night, and the stars above them were extraordinary, that deep, profligate scatter of them that is only visible far from the lights of cities. The Milky Way stretched bank to bank across the sky like something spilled. They stopped in the middle of the street and looked up at it for a moment, just looking. "I used to think I'd feel less lonely when I got settled somewhere," Charles said to the stars. "But the truth is, I felt lonelier once I stopped moving." A moving man has an excuse for the feeling. A settled man has to face it. She turned to look at him in the starlight. And now, he looked back at her. The expression on his face in that moment was one she would carry in her memory for the rest of her life, wholly open, wholly honest, stripped of the quiet that usually served as his armor. "Now I don't feel lonely at all," he said. "Not since this spring." She reached up and touched his face, her hand against his jaw, warm and certain and gentle, and he turned his cheek into her palm for just a moment, as if it were something he'd been waiting a long time to do, and then he turned his head and pressed his lips to her palm, and she felt the warmth of it all the way to her toes. "Charles," she said softly. "Nellie," he said, in the exact same tone, which was really a whole conversation. He kissed her then, properly, his hands gentle on her face, the way of a man who is not in a hurry and knows what he has standing in the middle of the Harlan Creek Main Street under the full spectacular glory of the Kansas night sky. And she kissed him back with everything she had, which was considerable. When they walked on, they were holding hands, and they didn't let go until they reached Mrs. Hatch's front door. "Good night, Nellie," he said. "Good night, Charles," she said. She went inside and stood in the hallway in the dark for a long moment, her heart still going fast, her face warm, entirely certain that she had never in her 24 years been happier than she was at this precise moment in time. Mrs. Hatch appeared from the kitchen in her nightcap, took one look at Nellie's face and said, "I'll make tea," and went back to the kitchen without a word about the late hour. The winter of 1878 settled over Harlan Creek hard and without apology. The first snow came in November, and by December the plains were white in every direction, the cold coming off the land in the mornings like something with weight and intent. The children still came to school, those who could make it through the snow wrapped in wool, and with the particular ruddy, cold-bitten hardiness of prairie children. Nellie stoked the wood stove that Charles kept well supplied throughout the winter without ever making a production of it, and she taught in her coat some mornings until the room warmed, and she was content. She and Charles had settled into something that had the quality of rightness, not the restless, uncertain excitement of early attraction, but the deeper, more sustaining warmth of two people who know each other well and choose each other clearly. He came to Sunday dinner at Mrs. Hatch's. Mrs. Hatch had invited him, which was, as Nellie said to Clara, equivalent to a declaration from the governor, and he helped Mrs. Hatch with the heavy things she would never ask for help with because she'd been asking for nothing for 40 years, and he did it without making a fuss, which was the only way she would have accepted it. Clara Birch said over coffee one January morning, "He is going to ask you to marry him." Nellie looked up from her cup. "You don't know that." "I know," Clara said serenely. "I know it the way I know when it's going to snow. It's in everything he does. He's just the kind of man who won't say the word until he's absolutely sure everything is ready." "Ready how?" "I suspect," Clara said, stirring her coffee thoughtfully, "that he wants to make sure you actually want to stay, that you're here because you love this place and this life, not because you haven't decided to go yet." Nellie thought about this for a long time after Clara left. She thought about it while walking to school through the January cold, her breath making small clouds in the air. She thought about what it meant that he was waiting for her certainty, rather than pressing for an answer before she'd had time to arrive at one honestly. She thought about how rare that was, a man whose love expressed itself as patience rather than demand. She arrived at the schoolhouse and built up the fire and laid out the morning's work, and by the time the children arrived she had decided something. She went to the livery that evening, in the blue winter dark, and she found Charles in the stable office with a lamp burning and a ledger open on the desk, doing the accounts for the month with the focused quiet that he brought to everything. He looked up when she came in, and his face did the thing it did when he saw her, that small, involuntary opening like a window. "Nellie," he said, "is everything all right?" "Everything is perfectly all right," she said. She sat down in the second chair and looked at him squarely. "I want you to know something. I'm not leaving, not ever. This is my place. This school, this town, this life I've built here. I'm not going back east, and I'm not looking for somewhere else. I am here because I want to be here completely and without reservation." He looked at her for a long moment, Something in his face was very still, and then it moved, the slow, warm certainty of it settling in. "I know," he said quietly. "I wanted to say it plainly," she said. "Because I think you needed to hear it plainly." "I did," he admitted. "Thank you for that." She smiled at him. "Now, what's for supper? I'm freezing." He laughed, that full, warm laugh that she counted among her great pleasures, and got up to put a pot on the small stove in the corner. He asked her to marry him in February. It was a Sunday afternoon, and they were walking along the frozen creek at the edge of town, the ice on the water gray-white in the pale winter light, the cottonwood trees bare-limbed and sculptural against the sky. He had been quieter than usual on the walk, with the quality of quietness that she had learned meant he was building towards something. She gave him time, the way she gave the children time with difficult questions. He stopped walking and turned to her. He did not go down on one knee, the ground was frozen solid, but he took both of her hands in his and held them, and he looked at her with the completely unguarded honesty that she loved most about him. And he said, "Nellie, I have spent my whole life trying to become the kind of person I thought this land deserved. Someone fair and honest and useful. And then you came here, and I understood for the first time that I was also trying to become the kind of person who deserved someone like you." He took a breath. "I would like you to marry me. I would like to spend my life alongside yours. I would like to build things with you, not just a house or a business, but a life that has the kind of gentleness in it that you've shown me matters." She was crying. She was not a woman who cried easily, but she was crying now, quietly and without embarrassment, because he had said exactly what was in his heart, and she recognized every word of it, and it went into her own heart and stayed. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Charles, of course, yes." He pulled her close then, and she put her arms around him and held on, and they stood there by the frozen creek in the February cold while the wind moved over the prairie around them. And she thought, this is the moment the story turns, not forward into difficulty, but forward into something that holds. They were married in April of 1879. The wedding was held outdoors, because the saloon church smelled of tobacco and spilled beer, and Nellie had decided firmly that she was being married in the spring air or not at all. And Charles had agreed with the ease of a man who has no strong opinions about venue as long as the important parts are right. Mrs. Hatch made a cake of such architectural ambition and buttercream detail that it was discussed in Harlan Creek for months afterward. Clara Birch stood beside Nellie with a bunch of prairie wildflowers in her hands and an expression of magnificent satisfaction. Gerald Pratt, who had somehow evolved over the course of the winter into something approaching a genuine admirer of Nellie's, attended and brought his whole family and contributed a side of beef to the wedding supper. Eli Hansen, now 9 years old and reading 3 grades above his age level, stood in the front row of the assembled townspeople and watched the ceremony with the serious, attentive expression of a child who is storing something important. The minister, who had come from Dodge City for the occasion, because Harlan Creek still didn't have a permanent minister, read the vows, and Charles and Nellie said them to each other in the April sunshine with the entire population of Harlan Creek as witness, their voices steady and warm, looking at each other the way two people look when they have chosen each other not from desperation or convention, but from clear-eyed, wholehearted decision. After the vows, Charles put his forehead against hers for a moment before he kissed her, just that small, quiet thing, the two of them with their eyes closed in the spring light, and the assembled crowd made a sound that was entirely involuntary and entirely approving. Biscuit, who had somehow gotten to the front of the crowd, sat at Charles's feet throughout the ceremony and was later included in the wedding photograph that a traveling photographer happened to be passing through town that week and offered to take. The photograph showed Charles in his good jacket, Nellie in the white dress Mrs. Hatch had helped her sew, and Biscuit sitting between them with the self-possession of a dog who knows he belongs. They moved into the small house that Charles had been building on the north side of town, adjacent to the livery stable, throughout the winter and spring. It was solid and well-made, with 2 bedrooms and a parlor and a kitchen with good south-facing windows. And Charles had built bookshelves into the parlor wall because he knew what Nellie's books meant to her. The shelves were the first thing she noticed when he showed her the finished house, and she stood in front of them for a long moment with her hand on the smooth planed wood. "You built them wide enough for the big volumes," she said. "I measured your largest one," he said. She turned around and kissed him, which he accepted with complete equanimity. The first year of their marriage had all the qualities that a good first year should have: the adjustment of 2 people's habits and rhythms into a shared life, the daily negotiations of preference and priority, the small discoveries that accumulate into deep knowledge of another person. She learned that he woke before dawn naturally and liked the quiet of the house in the dark. He learned that she read late and needed the lamp oil budget adjusted accordingly. She learned that he had nightmares, sometimes remnants of the cattle drive years, images he tried to leave behind that still came for him in the small hours, and that what helped was simply a hand on his back and her voice, low and steady, until the images receded. He learned that she was stubborn in ways she didn't always advertise, that the gentle manner could house an absolute determination that was, once engaged, entirely immovable. They argued sometimes, the way 2 people of strong character will. They argued about the school's budget and about the right way to handle a disagreement with the Pratt family and about whether the dog should sleep in the house. They argued in the direct, honest way of 2 people who respect each other enough not to go around the hard things, and then they resolved the arguments the same way, directly, honestly, without lingering resentment. The dog, for the record, slept in the house. In the spring of 1880, Nellie told Charles she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning while he was eating breakfast, and she watched his face go through about 7 distinct emotional states in approximately 10 seconds, ending in an expression of joy so complete and unguarded that it was startling on a face she associated with careful composure. He got up from the table and came to her and held her face in both hands and looked at her with everything he had, and then he pressed his lips to her forehead and held them there for a long moment. "Are you well?" he asked against her hair. "I am very well," she said. "Good," he said. "Good." He held her for a moment longer, then, "Sit down, I'll make you tea." "I'm pregnant, Charles, not injured." "Sit down," he said again, gently but with absolute conviction, and she sat down, smiling. She continued teaching through the spring and into the early summer, until August, when the pregnancy made the long days on her feet genuinely difficult. Mrs. Hatch, who had, over the course of the past year, transitioned from a figure of authority to something approaching family, came to help with the house on the days Nellie was tired, arriving with meals and opinions in equal measure, and accepting no refusal of either. Clara Birch was the one who stayed up with her through the long night of the labor. Charles was there throughout, steady and present in the way that was entirely characteristic of him, holding her hand through the difficult hours, speaking to her in the low, calm voice that had always been able to reach her when other things couldn't, and not once looking frightened, even though she could see, in the tight set of his jaw, that he was. Their son was born on a September morning in 1880, loud and insistent from his first breath, with a full head of dark hair and his father's brown eyes and his mother's determined expression. They named him Thomas Edmund Atkins, for Nellie's father. Charles held his son for the first time with the same careful steadiness he brought to every fragile thing, and the expression on his face as he looked at the baby was the most extraordinary thing Nellie had ever seen. It was not something she could describe in words exactly. It was the expression of a man who has been carrying a certain weight alone for a long time and has just understood completely that the weight is going to be different now. Shared. Transformed. "Hello, Thomas," he said, very quietly. The baby looked up at him with the unfocused intensity of the newly born. "We've been waiting for you." Nellie watched them from the pillow, exhausted and content in the way that has no equivalent, the particular deep, settled contentment of a woman who is exactly where she chose to be and knows it. Thomas Edmund Atkins grew the way prairie children do, fast and a little wild, with a serious streak that came from his father and a gift for language that came from his mother. By the time he was walking, Biscuit had appointed himself the child's protector, following Thomas through the house with the vigilant dedication of a dog who has found his highest purpose. Charles, watching this one morning over his coffee, said to Nellie, "That dog is going to live forever. He's decided he has to." "Love does that," Nellie said. He looked at her across the kitchen table in the morning light. "Yes," he said, "it does." In 1882, the town of Harlan Creek changed significantly. The railroad extended a line through to the south of town, and with it came new people and new commerce and the beginning of what would eventually be a real civic structure. A proper town council, a bank, a doctor who stayed longer than 6 months, and finally, a church building that was constructed over the summer and dedicated in the fall. The school grew too. Nellie had been advocating for a larger building and a second classroom for 2 years, and with the railroad came families with children, and the case became impossible to ignore. Gerald Pratt, who had gradually transformed himself over the years into one of the school's most reliable supporters, a fact that still occasionally surprised him, donated lumber for the addition. Charles built the second classroom himself, with help from 3 other men who had come to trust and like him over the years, and Nellie watched the construction with an emotion she had no word for in English, but which felt like the physical manifestation of everything she had worked for. She hired an assistant teacher, a young woman named Rose Alvarez, 22 years old, who had come from San Antonio with her family, and who had exactly the combination of warmth and steel that Nellie recognized and valued. Rose was not always immediately accepted. There were people in Harlan Creek who had opinions about a woman of Mexican descent in the schoolhouse that Nellie addressed directly, firmly, and without compromise. She told the school committee, in the plainest possible language, that Rose Alvarez was the most qualified person who had applied for the position and that she was hiring her. And if anyone had a problem with that, they could come and explain their reasoning to her face, and they were welcome to take their time preparing because she had heard every possible version of those arguments and had an answer for all of them. Nobody came. Charles, who had heard about the conversation from 3 different people before Nellie had a chance to tell him herself, said that evening, "Did you give them the look?" "What look?" "The look you give the children when they've said something that doesn't hold water. You don't raise your voice. Your expression doesn't change, but something happens in your eyes that makes a person want to reconsider their entire position." Nellie considered this. "I may have given them the look," she conceded. "I thought so," he said, and his admiration was entirely audible. Rose Alvarez stayed at the school for 8 years, eventually taking over Nellie's class when Nellie's duties expanded to running the school as a whole, and the 2 women became genuine friends, and then something closer to sisters. Rose's presence in the schoolhouse became, over time, unremarkable, which was exactly what Nellie had intended. In 1883, Nellie and Charles had their second child, a daughter they named Eleanor Clara, for Nellie's mother and for Clara Birch, who received the honor with the particular combination of gratitude and determination, not to show it, that was entirely consistent with her character. Eleanor was different from Thomas from the beginning, quieter, more watchful, with a stillness that Charles recognized as his own, and a warmth that was all Nellie. She liked to sit with her father while he worked, watching his hands with the serious attention of a child who is memorizing something important, and she liked to listen to her mother read aloud in the evenings with a quality of focused pleasure that Nellie found deeply familiar. Biscuit, who by 1883 was old by any reasonable dog standard and moved more slowly and slept more, still roused himself each morning to make his way to Eleanor's cradle and look in at her with the attentive concern of a seasoned guardian accepting a new charge. Charles watched this one morning and said, with quiet feeling, "That is a good dog." "He is the best dog," Nellie agreed. Biscuit passed in the winter of 1884, in the stable where he had always slept, quietly and without distress, on a pile of straw that Charles had arranged specifically because the old dog liked it. Charles found him in the morning and sat with him for a while before he told Nellie, and when he came in and told her, his voice was steady but his eyes were not, and she came to him the same way he had always come to her in the difficult things, present and close, and not trying to make it less than it was. They buried Biscuit under the cottonwoods by the creek, in the place where they had first held hands, and Charles and Thomas, who was now 4 years old and took the loss with the specific incomprehension of a child who has not yet fully learned that things end, put a flat stone over the spot. Thomas made his father carve the dog's name on it. Charles did this without argument, spending an afternoon with his carving tools in the pale winter sun. "That's a proper monument," Nellie said, looking at the finished stone. "He deserved one," Charles said. The years that followed were full in the way that a well-lived life is full, not without difficulty, not without loss, not without the ordinary friction of people trying to be their best selves in an imperfect world, but full in the sense of being inhabited completely. Nellie ran the school with a combination of vision and pragmatism that made it, by the late 1880s, one of the best-regarded schools in that part of Kansas. She had fought for and won a proper school library, a science curriculum that included agricultural and environmental knowledge the children of the plains would actually use, and a reading program that she wrote herself based on years of watching what actually engaged these particular children. She had become, without ever quite meaning to, a figure in the town, not a figure of power in the way that men exercised power, but a figure of influence that operated differently, through relationship and trust and the accumulated knowledge of having looked closely at people for years and given them her honest attention. When the town council argued about the property dispute with the Navarro family to the south of town, a dispute that had to do with grazing rights and water access and had the potential to turn ugly, it was Nellie who sat down separately with each party and listened until she understood what they actually needed, and then brought them to the same table with the specific proposals that allowed each side to walk away with the essential things intact. The Navarro family sent her a basket of tomatoes from their garden. She considered this the equal of any formal recognition. Charles, in those same years, built the livery into something substantial, not large by city standards, but important to the town. He had 3 employees by the mid-1880s, all of them treated with the same fairness and respect he brought to every interaction. He had a particular reputation among the traveling people who came through Harlan Creek, the cowboys on the drives, the settlers moving further west, the commercial travelers going between towns, as a man whose word was his bond, and whose horses were well cared for, and whose prices were what he said they were. He was also, by this point, the person most of the town went to when they needed someone to think clearly about a difficult problem, not because he told people what to do, but because he listened without judgment and then asked the questions that helped people think better. He had not become this deliberately. He had simply continued being himself, with increasing depth, and the town had organized itself around what he was the way water organizes itself around the shape of its banks. He and Nellie talked about everything still, the way they had always talked, honestly, fully, with the willingness to be wrong and the willingness to be moved. Their conversations over the kitchen table, in the evenings after the children were in bed, were the conversations of 2 people who had been paying attention to the same world from adjacent perspectives for years, and who found still that the other person saw things they had missed. In 1887, Nellie received a letter from a woman she had never met, a schoolteacher in a town further west who had heard of Nellie's methods and wanted to know more. Nellie wrote back, and then they continued writing, and then other teachers wrote, And eventually Nellie found herself at the center of an informal correspondence network of women educating frontier children, exchanging ideas and resources, and the specific encouragement of people who understood each other's particular challenges. She told Charles about it one evening with a kind of wondering pleasure, as if she hadn't quite seen it coming and was still adjusting to it. "You're building a school system," he said. "I'm just writing letters," she said. "You've been building something since the day you arrived here," he said. "You just call it different things depending on what it is." She looked at him in the lamplight, this man she had chosen and been chosen by, who had seen her clearly from almost the beginning and had never once asked her to be less than she was. "I love you," she said, which was not the non sequitur it might have seemed. "I love you, Nellie," he said, "more than I know how to say properly, but I hope you've been paying attention because it's been in everything else I do." She had been paying attention. She had been paying attention to all of it, from the first window pane he'd fixed and the first load of wood he'd left at the schoolhouse door, through all the years and seasons and small, careful acts of a man who expressed himself in the language of showing up, and she had understood every word. In the spring of 1889, Thomas was 9 years old and Alina was 6, and Nellie discovered she was expecting again. She told Charles in the kitchen, as she had told him of Thomas, on a Tuesday morning, and he looked at her with the same joy not diminished by familiarity, but if anything deepened by it, the way a well-used path shows more clearly where it goes. Their third child was born in November of 1889, a boy they named James William, for Charles's father who had died some years before, and for no particular William, but because the name had a solidity to it that they both liked. James was from the first moment a cheerful, round-faced, spectacularly loud person who had opinions about everything, expressed them without reservation, and was adored by his older siblings with a completeness that did much to make up for the chaos he introduced. Charles, looking at his youngest son in the first weeks after the birth, said to Nellie, "I think he might be the most confident person I've ever met." "He's 3 weeks old," she pointed out. "He's already mastered the important skill of making known what he needs without shame," Charles said. "That's more than most adults manage." Nellie laughed and leaned her head against his shoulder and looked at their son, and the kitchen was warm with the November fire and the smell of bread, and the particular domestic sweetness of a life that had been built carefully and well and was now, in all its fullness, entirely real. Harlan Creek continued to grow through the 1890s, shaped by the same forces shaping the rest of the country: the expanding railroad, the Homestead Acts, the gradual arrival of a more settled kind of civilization. The cattle drives that had defined the town's early years became less frequent as the open range gave way to fenced land and the railheads moved. The town grew a hardware store, and then a bank, and then a proper newspaper, and eventually a hotel larger than the single-story establishment that had seen Nellie and Charles's first real dinner together. The schoolhouse became a proper school building with 4 classrooms by 1895, and Nellie was its principal. Rose Alvarez was still there, now with a classroom of her own and a reputation that drew students from as far as 30 miles. Eli Hansen, now in his mid-20s, had become the town's primary accountant. His gift for numbers, carefully developed in Nellie's schoolroom, put to exact and practical use. He stopped by the school sometimes to talk to the current students, and he always, when he left, said something to Nellie that was a version of thank you without using those words directly, and she always understood it perfectly. Danny Pratt had become a rancher, as he'd predicted, but he'd also become, to his own evident surprise, someone who had books on his shelf alongside the livestock records and the weather almanacs, and who was occasionally caught quoting something that had clearly originated in a classroom. He had never quite admitted where it came from. Nellie had never pressed him. Gerald Pratt had died in 1891, of a heart that had worked too hard for too many years. At his funeral, his son spoke about his father, and in the middle of the eulogy Danny said, with the awkward sincerity of a man who is not practiced at this kind of speech, that his father had not always been right about everything, but that in his later years he'd gotten better at knowing it. It was as specific an acknowledgement as anyone in the Pratt family was likely to offer, and Nellie, sitting in the church pew with Charles's hand in hers, thought it was enough. Growth comes in different shapes. The important thing is that it comes. Mrs. Hatch, who had become over the years the closest thing to a grandmother that Nellie's children had, died in 1893 at the age of 78, sharp-minded to the last, in her own bed, having refused to slow down until approximately 3 days before the end. She left the boarding house to a younger woman who continued running it with admirable efficiency, and she left to Nellie, in her will, the set of china teacups she had never used because she'd been saving them. Nellie used them every Sunday. She thought Mrs. Hatch would have approved. Clara Birch, who had remained Nellie's closest friend through all of it, eventually remarried in 1895. A quiet, decent man named Henry who had come to Harlan Creek with the railroad, and who looked at Clara the way you look at something you can't believe you found. Nellie stood beside Clara at her second wedding as Clara had stood beside Nellie at hers, and she cried again, which was becoming a pattern she'd given up pretending to resist. In the spring of 1899, Harlan Creek prepared to enter the new century. There was a particular awareness in the air that the year turning would be something, though nobody was quite sure what. The town organized a celebration for New Year's Eve, a dance in the town hall that had been built 7 years prior, with a fiddle player and a piano brought in from Dodge City and bunting on the walls, and enough food to last the town for a week afterward. Nellie and Charles attended with their children Thomas, now 19, tall and thoughtful in the way of his father, already talking about studying law in Dodge City. Eleanor, 16, with her mother's warmth in her father's eyes and a gift for drawing that had surprised everyone. James, 10 years old and impossible to tire, currently attempting to slide across the polished hall floor in his good boots. They danced. Charles was not and had never been a natural dancer, but he had learned over the years with the same deliberate application he brought to everything else, and he moved well enough, and he held her properly, and what he lacked in grace he compensated for entirely in the quality of attention he paid to her. She felt, every time they danced, as if she were the only person in the room. Near midnight, they stepped outside for a moment, the air cold and sharp and full of stars, the same sprawling, luminous Kansas sky that had been above them on the night he'd kissed her for the first time, 21 years ago. They stood side by side and looked up at it in comfortable silence. "We built something here," Charles said. She took his arm. "We did. More than I knew was possible when I came," he said. "More than I deserved." She turned to look at him, this man who was 48 years old now, with gray at his temples and deep lines at the corners of his eyes, and who was still in the essential qualities exactly the person she had met in a general store in the spring of 1878 and found, again and again, to be someone worth knowing more completely. "You earned every bit of it," she said. "We both did. This wasn't luck, Charles. This was work and choice and showing up." "Every day," he said. "Every day," she agreed. He turned to look at her in the starlight, and his expression had that quality of complete openness that she still, after all these years, found to be the most beautiful thing about him. "I'm glad you came off that stagecoach," he said. "I'm glad you didn't leave when they told you to. I'm glad you were stubborn enough and brave enough and gentle enough to stay." "Gentle enough," she said, smiling. "Gentle enough," he said. "You showed this town what that word actually means. That it's not softness in the face of difficulty, it's care that doesn't give up. I've watched you do it for 20 years, with the children, with the families, with this place. Gentle was what this land was missing. You were right. You've been right about that since the day you got here." The church bell began to toll midnight. Inside the hall, the crowd was counting down, their voices coming through the walls muffled and joyful. Charles held out his hand to her, the same hand that had held hers by the creek all those years ago, calloused and warm and entirely certain. She took it. They stood in the last seconds of the old century, in the town they had built their life in, under the vast and uncompromising Kansas sky. And when midnight came, they were looking at each other, not at the sky, because there was nothing up there that was more worth seeing. Inside, Thomas came looking for them and found them still outside, and he stood in the doorway and shook his head at them with an expression that managed to be both embarrassed and deeply fond, and said, "It is midnight, you know. There is cake." "There is always cake," Nellie said serenely. "Come on, then," Thomas said, and held the door, and they went in. The hall was warm and lit with lanterns and full of the town, every face they knew, every family they had been part of for 20 years, every child who had sat in a classroom and grown into someone real. Alina was dancing with a boy Nellie hadn't yet evaluated but intended to, and James was, predictably, everywhere at once, and the fiddle was playing something quick and sweet. Charles guided Nellie to the edge of the dance floor and turned to her with a question in his eyes, which was his way of asking, and she stepped into his arms, which was her way of saying yes, the same as it had always been. They danced into the new century, in a town they had helped to build, with their children around them and their friends near, and the stars outside going their appointed courses above the Kansas plains, which was as it had always been, and would be for a long time, yet wide and demanding and honest and entirely, in its unsentimental way, beautiful. And in the morning they would wake in their house and make coffee and tend the life they had built together, and it would not be perfect and it would not be easy, and it would be exactly what they had both chosen, fully and without reservation from the beginning. It would be, in every way that mattered, enough. More than enough. It would be everything.